From now on, you are mine.
Now with Nacho working for him from within the Salamanca side of the business, Gus is able to shift his attention to the creation of a secret underground meth lab for when he eventually cuts ties from the cartel. After finding a secure location for the lab with the help of Lydia Rodart Quayle, a business executive at the giant corporation Los Pollos Hermanos is owned by, Madrigal Electromotive, and who also has an odd obsession with stevia.
And I'm assuming we don't have stevia. Have enough.
He brings in Mike to run the operation, as well as some German engineers to actually build it. But to keep the job as low profile as possible, the engineers must stay isolated during the building process, away from their loved ones. As the year progresses though, this eventually proves to be too much for the head engineer, Werner Ziegler, who misses his wife so much that he decides to run off. So Mike leads a search team to find him. But as they head out, they're unknowingly watched by the new head of the Salamanca side of the business, Lalo Salamanca, another of Hector's nephews. Speaking of Hector, although his original diagnosis was pretty bad, he's now been nursed back to health, with his recovery mostly being aided by Gus, as he wanted to make sure Hector would still be aware of the tortures he plans on putting him and his family through. Although he no longer has the ability to speak and is confined to a wheelchair, he's still able to understand conversation and communicate using a bell given to him by Lalo, who's been keeping a close eye on Gus on his behalf. And after seeing Gus's crew all on the move, he begins tailing Mike, who heads to Travel Wire, a money transfer office where Mike learns Werner had been, as well as the spa resort Werner went to after. He eventually notices Lalo tailing him though, and gets away by entering a parking lot and causing the machine to chew him. So Lalo heads back to Travel Wire and kills their employee Fred before looking through the security footage to see what Mike was doing there, and figures out the spa resort Werner went to as well. So he calls him, pretending to be another of Gus's employees, but Mike luckily makes it to Werner before too much information can be revealed. Still, Gus is furious that Werner had escaped and nearly allowed the Salamancas to discover what he's doing, so he orders Mike to kill him. And although he doesn't want to, since he and Werner had become pretty good friends over the course of the project, he reluctantly follows through with the order. After covering up the purpose of their construction project, as well as why they were searching for a Werner Ziegler, Mike tells Gus he's out, feeling great guilt over killing Werner, which subsequently leads to him falling back on drinks night after night and getting into fights with the neighborhood thugs, who nearly end up killing him. But the next morning, he wakes up in Mexico, under the care of Gus's personal doctor, Barry Goodman. Gus also arrives there later, and reveals this place to actually be a memorial for Max, as he attempts to persuade Mike to return to his employ, rather than continuing his self-destructive behavior, claiming he needs a soldier in his war against the Salamancas that understands his need for revenge. And ultimately, Mike accepts. By this point, Jimmy's one-year suspension had finally come to an end, and all that was left was to go through a committee meeting to get reinstated. But the committee shockingly denies him for being what they consider as insincere, and Kim deduces this is due to him not having mentioned his dead brother at all. So at his appeal, Jimmy plans on reading a letter Chuck left him in his will, to show how much he and his brother loved each other. But just as he begins reading it, he breaks down and gives a heartfelt speech about his and Chuck's complicated relationship, which works in getting him reinstated. But it turns out Jimmy had been acting the whole time, and he still doesn't seem to care about his brother's death at all. Nor does he care to work under the name McGill anymore, so he applies for a DBA.
Wait, Jimmy, what? It's all good, man.
During his year away from the law, Jimmy had gotten a job at a cell phone store, from which he began a side hustle of selling some of their drop phones to criminals for profit under the name Saul Goodman. And for his new law practice, he believes these criminals could actually be great potential clients. But since they don't know him as Jimmy McGill, he'll now be doing business as Saul Goodman moving forward. And it proves to be a success, with him racking in more clients than ever. But soon enough, his new clientele draws the attention of some more frightening criminals, such as Lalo Salamanca, who he's taken to meet by Nacho. Nacho's been having a rough go at it as of late, as Gus's frustration has continued to build thanks to Lalo's arrival. Gus has put pressure on Nacho to gain the trust of, threatening to kill his father if he isn't able to do so. So Nacho attempts to later, following a poker game, during which one of their dealers, Domingo, or Ocho Loco as Lalo called him after Domingo fell for his bluff while having a way better hand, gets caught red-handed by the cops and arrested as they search throughout the rest of the building. So Nacho, realizing this could be the perfect opportunity to gain Lalo's trust, sneaks back into the building and just barely manages to salvage several bags of product. Following this, Nacho becomes Lalo's right-hand man, and is subsequently filled in on his schemes against Gus, with his current idea being to use Crazy 8's arrest to disrupt Gus's business, hence why they meet with Saul. Saul's hesitant to help them at first, but after receiving a pretty big money offer, he accepts, and helps get Domingo a deal to work as an informant for DEA agents Hank Schrader and Steve Gomez. Nacho, of course, tells Gus about Lalo's plans, but Gus can't risk him knowing there to be a rat in his ranks, so he allows some of his guys to get caught, as well as $700,000. After completing this job for Lalo, Saul hopes to be done with anything cartel related, but Lalo makes it clear they'll meet again, so in the meantime, he uses his cartel ways to gain leverage with his other clients. Although Jimmy's law practice is thriving, Kim has once again begun feeling dissatisfied with her current situation with Mesa Verde. After her accident, Kim realized that she couldn't handle all of their needs on her own, so she joined another big firm, Schweikart & Coakley, which in turn allowed her to spend more time doing public defender work, which she found to be much more enjoyable. But her issues with Mesa Verde begin again when, in order to build a new call center, they have to force an old man, Everett Acker, off his land. So Kim, not liking the idea of kicking an old man out of his own house for some big bank, instead comes up with a plan using Jimmy's conning expertise and has him become Acker's lawyer, helping him delay all of Mesa Verde's attempts to build their call center. Kevin Wachtel won't back down though, so they put together an even bigger scheme, involving Jimmy creating a bunch of anti-Mesa Verde commercials. But after her boss, Richard Schweikart, starts suspecting she's working alongside Jimmy in favor of Acker and not her own clients, Kim decides to pull the plug. So Jimmy meets with Richard, Kim, Kevin, and Paige to make a deal. But instead of making said deal, he goes through with their original plan and successfully cons them into moving their call center elsewhere. Kim's furious that he went against her wishes, but he claims he only hid it to protect her legally. Still, it looks like this may be their breaking point, until she shockingly suggests they get married, but only to prevent any more secrets since they'll have spousal privilege. And Jimmy agrees, so the two head to the courthouse the next morning to make it official. And although they do seem happy to be married, Kim makes it clear that there can't be any more secrets, no matter how badly Jimmy doesn't want to tell her. But directly after this, his legal services are once again called upon by Lalo Salaman. After Lalo gave the DEA information to disrupt Gus's business, Gus put together a scheme to get Lalo locked up, having Mike impersonate a detective to anonymously bring police information on who killed the Travel Wire employee. The cops then tracked Lalo down and arrested him, although under his fake identity, Jorge de Guzman, so they don't know they have a member of the cartel in custody. And so Lalo called in Saul to help get him out on bail so he could head back to Mexico before they learn of his real identity. And later, Jimmy's met at his apartment by Mike, who informs him that the people he's working for also want Lalo to head to Mexico. As even in prison, Lalo proved to be a thorn in Gus's side after sending for Nacho to blow up New Mexico's Los Pollos Hermanos restaurant. So Jimmy manages to get him bail, although it's unfortunately set at $7 million. But Lalo says he can make that work and offers Jimmy the job of retrieving the money, to which he agrees in exchange for $100,000. He then meets with the cousins near the border and retrieves the money before driving off. But on his way back, he's ambushed and robbed by what appears to be a rival gang. But before they can kill him, they're suddenly taken out by a sniper in the distance, revealed to be Mike Ehrmantraut, who'd been keeping an eye on the money drop, though he didn't expect the shootout to go down. Jimmy appears traumatized by what just happened, but is able to collect himself as the two start heading back in his car, until it quickly breaks down, so they have to push it over a cliff before moving forward on foot, eventually making it back to Albuquerque after an excruciatingly long walk. Upon his return, Jimmy hands in the money and gets Lalo bailed out, claiming his car just broke down, so he had to walk all the way back. Meanwhile, Gus finds out that it was actually Bolsa that set up the hit on Jimmy, believing Lalo's imprisonment would end their feud. Although Jimmy promised to no longer keep anything from Kim, he did tell her that he was going to make a pickup for Lalo. He believes it's best for her not to know what actually went down and sticks with the same story he told him. But she quickly gets an idea of what really happened after finding his coffee cup with a bullet hole in it. And nearly losing Jimmy makes her realize what's truly important, so she drops Mesa Verde and leaves Schweikart & Coakley to focus all of her time on pro bono work. Meanwhile, Lalo begins his trip back to Mexico. Stops after seeing Jimmy's car in a ditch with bullet holes in it, and instead heads back to confront Jimmy at his home. He repeatedly asks him to retell his story, hoping he cracks. But before he does, Kim interrupts and fearlessly questions Lalo, who admits he'd seen Jimmy's car. So Kim comes up with a cover, claiming that in New Mexico, if you leave a car on the side of the road, someone's gonna shoot it up, and claims that he needs to get his house in order instead of relying on a lawyer he barely knows to do his bidding. So Lalo leaves and finally makes his way back to Mexico, while Jimmy and Kim hide out at a hotel for the night. With everything that's happened, Kim still decides to go to the courthouse the next morning for her clients. And while there, she's met by Howard, who'd fallen into a deep depression for a while, carrying the guilt of Chuck's death, but has now managed to get back on his feet as HHM has begun thriving once again. In an attempt to make up for the wrongs of his past, he met with Jimmy earlier and offered him a job at HHM. But this rubbed Jimmy the wrong way, so he just started messing with Howard by throwing bowling balls at his car and sending prostitutes during his business hours. So now Howard confronts Kim about this and suggests that Jimmy's behavior is not only damaging to himself, but to her as well, as he believes it was Jimmy that caused her to drop Mesa Verde. And this assumption angers Kim, who claims they're perfectly fine and that she makes her own decisions. While Kim was at the courthouse, Jimmy went over to Mike's house, looking for more information on Lalo, and after displaying his fear of losing Kim, Mike informs him that Lalo will be dead by the end of the night. With Nacho now having become Lalo's most trusted associate, Lalo decided to bring him along on his trip to Mexico, looking to get him a promotion in the cartel hierarchy. But as as we know, Nacho's still working for Gus. So when the planned hit comes to fruition, Nacho's the one who causes the distraction and opens the gate to allow Gus's hitman in. But Lalo proves to be a more formidable opponent than they had thought, and manages to take them all out, before faking his own death by killing a neighbor that bared a resemblance to him and burning his corpse. Back in Albuquerque, after returning to their hotel, Jimmy and Kim began jokingly discussing ways they could mess with Howard, until it eventually got more serious, with Kim suggesting to potentially destroy his career so they can finally get Jimmy's share of the sandpiper. He warns her that she won't be okay with what they'd have to do, but she seems even more ready for what could come than he is. With all of the cartel believing Lalo's dead, their top priority is finding Nacho, who trusted that he and his father would finally be set free to start new lives after opening Lalo's gate. But it turns out Gus was never planning on letting him go, believing he would always be another loose end to worry about. And Nacho eventually realizes this, but agrees to do whatever Gus wants as long as his father is kept safe, and Mike promises to make sure Gus keeps his word. So they retrieve Nacho and bring him back to the US, where he's brought before Bolsa, Hector, and the cousins to confess that he'd been working for Alvarez, the head of a cartel in Peru. But he then shifts off the planned script to defiantly confess to Hector that he was the one who put him in a nursery home and caused his stroke, before suddenly breaking out of his zip tie with a broken shard of glass he'd secretly grabbed earlier and holding Bolsa at gunpoint. He then takes a look at Hector, then looks at Gus, and lastly looks out at Mike, watching from a distance before shooting himself in the head. Meanwhile, after faking his own death, Lalo had called Hector to inform him that he's still alive and plans on returning to kill Gus. But Hector instead suggested he find proof of the lab, so they can cut out Gus without getting cut out themselves. So Lalo headed to Germany, where he found Werner Ziegler's wife, Margaret Ziegler, who then led him to one of Werner's men from the construction of the lab, Casper, who he tortured into telling him where the lab was being built, before now making his way back to the US and hiding out in the sewers as he waits for the right moment to enter the laundry, which the lab is underneath. There, he once again calls Hector to fill him in on what he's learned, but notices that someone's tracking the call. That's someone being Gus, who'd realized Lalo was still alive after a meeting with Hector and Bolsa, who was hoping the two would finally call a truce. But based on Hector's confident smile, Gus knew there was something else going on. Lalo, of course, knows it's Gus listening in, so instead of telling Hector his real plan, he tells him that he's going back to his original plan of just killing Gus, which sends all of Gus's men and most of the laundry security to Gus's home. Throughout all of this, Jimmy and Kim had been setting up their scheme against Howard, at first subtly damaging his reputation by convincing Cliff Main and some of his other associates that he has a drug addiction, as well as Jimmy impersonating him to make it appear he mistreats prostitutes, until Howard learned of their scheme and sent a private investigator to follow Jimmy's every move. Kim also feels that she's being followed, but it doesn't appear to be Howard's PI, and after confronting them, she's met by Mike Ehrmantraut, who informs her that Lalo's still alive, so he's having his men watch over her and Jimmy in case he shows up, and asks her to just pretend they aren't there, to which she agrees, and also decides to not tell Jimmy about for now. But going back to Howard's PI, it turns out he's actually secretly been working for Kim and Jimmy, so the photos he was bringing into Howard were set up by them, and eventually their big plan comes to fruition during a mediation between Sandpiper's lawyers, HHM, and Davis and Maine, with the PI having brought in photos that convinced Howard that the mediator for their meeting, Judge Casimiro, was being paid off by Jimmy to make sure the case was settled. Also in the photos was a sticky substance that dilated Howard's pupils, so with him throwing out wild accusations with no evidence, since the photos were later swapped out by his PI without him knowing, and him appearing to be on drugs, Cliff is forced to settle. Later that night, Howard confronts Jimmy and Kim at their home about their elaborate scheme, and expresses his disappointment in the life Kim's decided to take on, believing she had greater potential than this. They try to get him to leave multiple times, but he refuses, and continues berating them until suddenly, Lalo Salamanca enters the room and shoots Howard in the head. He then gives Jimmy his car keys, a gun, and an address to which he wants him to go and kill the home's owner. But Jimmy instead says Kim should do it, and Lalo, not really caring who does, agrees. So Kim begins making her way to the home, and as she does, Lalo ties Jimmy to a chair and tells him about what happened at his home thanks to Ignacio Varga. And since Nacho introduced him to Jimmy, he no longer has any trust in him either. Jimmy tries to plead that he knew nothing about what Ignacio was going to do.
It wasn't me. It was the guy.
But Lalo just puts a gag in his mouth and exits the apartment. Kim, meanwhile, has made it to the home and gets ready to kill its resident. But right when the door opens, Mike shows up behind her and grabs the gun out of her hand before shoving her inside of what turns out to be the home of Gustavo Fring. Upon learning that Lalo is at their apartment, Mike heads over there with a squad of his men, but all they end up finding is Jimmy, still tied up and alone. While back at Fring's house, Gus, who's still hiding inside his bunker, calls Victor and asks for the phone to be handed over to Kim, curious as to why Lalo sent it. And Kim replies that he actually wanted to send Jimmy originally, but he was able to convince him to send her instead. This leaves Gus confused, not understanding why Lalo would voluntarily change his plan, and quickly realizes that this was all just a diversion, as Lalo has actually made his way to the laundry. Gus arrives there soon after with a few of his men, but they're quickly shot down by Lalo, and Gus is then forced at gunpoint to give him a tour of the lab as he records the whole thing. Now having gotten everything he needs out of Gus, Lalo looks to kill him, but before he can, Gus stomps on a power cable, which brings the lab to complete darkness, and sprints towards a gun he'd previously hidden inside the lab in case of a scenario like this. The two engage in a shootout through the darkness until Gus runs out of bullets, and when he turns the lights back on, it's revealed that he'd landed a fatal shot, with Lalo smiling as he dies. Mike and his men then clean up Howard's body before taking him to and burying him underneath the lab beside Lalo. With this all appearing to finally be over, although they're never told whether or not Lalo's actually dead, Jimmy and Kim try to go back to life as it was, per Mike's advice. But the guilt proves to be too much for Kim to handle, and she decides to retire from being a lawyer. She also comes to the realization that her and Jimmy staying together is not only bad for them, but for everyone around them. So she tells him she loves him one last time before leaving to put an end to their romance. Over the next several months, Jimmy completely transforms himself and really begins leaning into the Saul Goodman persona, now living in a very expensive house and sleeping around with prostitutes, as his law practice has continued to gain more and more traction thanks to his known previous association with Lalo. Although he appears to have no care for what he'd gone through in his past, when set to meet with Kim for what looks to be the final time so they can sign off on their divorce, he seems shooken up and saddened. But once Kim enters his office, he reverts back to the carefree Saul Goodman. Kim's completely taken aback by how Jimmy's handling everything, and outside she displays her displeasure when being approached by a local drug dealer, Jesse Pinkman, whose partner Emilio Koyama is looking to hire Saul as his lawyer. So Jesse asks her if Saul's really worth the hire, to which she responds, "When I knew him, he was." Around 4 years later, Emilio actually ends up getting caught while cooking meth by previously mentioned DEA agents Hank and Gomez, and although Jesse manages to escape out the window, he ends up getting recognized from inside the DEA's car by his former high school chemistry teacher, Walter White. A few days prior to this, Walt had been celebrating his 50th birthday with his family and friends, including his pregnant wife Skylar, his son Walter Jr., born with cerebral palsy, and his brother-in-law Hank, and during said celebration, showcased a news broadcast covering the $700,000 he'd recently seized from a small-time meth lab. And this large amount of money caught Walt's attention, as he's been struggling to make ends meet even whilst working 2 jobs as a high school teacher and cashier at a car wash under his exploitative boss Bogdan. Hank recognized his interest and offered to take him on a ride along sometime, which Walt eventually agrees to a couple days later after suddenly collapsing to the floor while at work and being diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer, resulting in him quitting his job at the car wash, though he's kept his diagnosis hidden from his family for the time being. This brings us back to the moment he spots Jesse from the backseat, but instead of turning him in, Walt tracks him down later that night and suggests they partner up.
You know the business, and I know the chemistry.
Although hesitant at first, Jesse ultimately agrees, and the two begin using a used RV to function as a mobile meth lab. They take it out far into the desert and cook their first batch, which Jesse describes as the best he's ever seen, and looks to sell through his associate, Crazy 8, who's no longer under the Salamanca's employ and has established himself as a solo drug dealer, taking advantage of his relations with the DEA. Turns out, he's also the cousin of Jesse's former partner, Emilio, and it appears that he was actually the one who ratted him out. But he's managed to get him out on bail and convince him that it was Jesse who snitched, so the two threaten him into taking them to meet his cook. And once there, Emilio recognizes Walter, since he'd been with the DEA when he got busted, so they look to kill them. But Walt's able to make a deal, offering up his formula in exchange for their lives. Instead of showcasing his formula though, Walt creates an explosive poisonous gas that incapacitates Crazy 8 and kills Emilio. So they're now left with the responsibility of killing Crazy 8. So to decide who has to do it, they flip a coin and it lands on Walt. Walt spends the next day trying to find a good reason not to kill Domingo, but he's ultimately forced to commit his second murder after noticing Domingo had stolen a broken piece of plate dropped earlier and intended to kill him with it. He then rids of the body and returns home, and upon his return, he informs his family that he has cancer. A few days later, Walt and Skylar attend his former best friend Elliot's birthday party, during which it's revealed that he and Walt had actually co-founded their own scientific research company, Gray Matter Technologies, after graduating college. At that time, Walt had been dating his lab assistant, Gretchen, but while on vacation with her and her family, he began feeling inferior to their wealth, and decided to break up with her, as well as sell his share of the company for $5,000. Well, since then, Gretchen and Elliot have formed a relationship and are now married, while Gray Matter is now worth billions of dollars. They've appeared to make amends since though, and at the party, Elliot even offers Walt a job at the company, but he declined upon learning Skylar had told him about his diagnosis. and believing his offer to be charity, which he refuses to accept, Walt instead continues cooking with Jesse to pay his medical bills, but convinces Skylar they're being paid by Gretchen and Ellie. Although they've got plenty of product cooked up, Jesse has struggled to sell as much of it as Walt had hoped, so he suggests they sell it wholesale to a distributor, and Jesse's friend Skinny Pete claims to know just the guy, having shared a cell with Tuco Salamanca, who by this point had gotten out of prison and began running the family meth business. So Skinny sets up a meeting between him and Jesse, but rather than pay for their product, Tuco just beats him within an inch of his life and steals it, which prompts Walt to step up in his absence, under his criminal alias Heisenberg, meeting with and threatening Tuco by creating a fulminated mercury explosion, which gains his respect, so he agrees to form a partnership with them. But before their next meeting, Walt and Jesse are forced to change up their formula, as pseudo's in short supply, so they begin using methylamine instead, giving their signature blue sky its color, which makes no difference to Tuco, and their agreed exchange goes as planned, until Tuco's associate No-Dose talks out of line, prompting Tuco to suddenly beat him to death with his bare hands. This sudden act of violence makes Walt and Jesse rethink their partnership, and the two make plans to kill Tuco, with Walt processing castor beans into ricin so they can poison him when the opportunity presents itself. But before they can gain said opportunity, Tuco kidnaps them, with plans of taking them to Mexico so they can continue cooking for him while he lays low from the cops, as he'd been forced on the run after No-Dose's body was found by the DEA, along with his other associate, Gonzo,